Okay, let's go ahead and do our next plant list. This week, we're going to talk about flowering and trees and shrubs. So as our second list here, these are things that are worth looking at right now in the landscape. And so you notice the seasons are starting to change, and I like to try to use plants that are worth looking at this time. In a few months' time, they may not be as showy or as noticeable. And so we'll talk about them this week. We're also going to talk about a few plants that go hand in hand with last week's list, because I give you two lists. And then after that, we will have our first exam covering 20 plants. And so some of these you'll recognize as similar or related, perhaps, to some from our first list. So here we are with plant list 1B, flowering trees and shrubs. Our first several plants we're going to talk about are acacia, and we learned about one acacia last week. We'll learn about a few more this week. As I mentioned before, many acacias have the tendency to become invasive or problematic in San Diego, but these ones do not. So these ones would be good acacia to recommend to your clients, or ones that you could plant without any real concern for them spreading and becoming weeds in our wildland. Additionally, these ones will be kind of interesting to compare with our other acacia species, because it came up in the chat that acacia has a unique adaptation for drought tolerance, and that is to drop some of its leaves and actually have the phylode, which is kind of like the petiole of the leaf, the stem of the leaf. It gets elongated, and that's what does the photosynthesis, and that's a way to prevent water loss. So the acacias we'll see today express phyllodes instead of leaves. Our first one here is Acacia cultriformis, knife acacia. There's a few other common names for this one, and one of them's dogtooth acacia. And the reason it has both common names, dogtooth and knife, is the shape of the phylode, which you can see on the right-hand image. They tend to be broad, a little bit wide, and then they have a slight point. They're not sharp to the touch, but it gives it the look of a bunch of knife blades or a bunch of dog teeth, however you want to think about it. This one comes from Eastern Australia, gets to be about 6 to 10 feet tall, and is a flowering shrub that looks quite ornamental and attractive, whether the flowers are on or not. The phyllodes and the leaves, as you can see, have that gray-green color, which is typically termed glaucous. So if it's glaucous, then it's kind of bluish, grayish green in color. That's a drought adaptation. So it can be in full sun without having to experience too much photosynthesis and therefore water loss, kind of like sunscreen for the plant. And the flowers you can see are relatively small. They're about 1/8 of an inch in size, but they are borne on large flower stalks that are called racemes. So you will see lots of yellow in with this plant, even though the individual flowers are quite small. It comes from Eastern Australia and is native to most acacias are native to the dry tropics or subtropics. So they're drought tolerant, but they can also be in somewhat of a tropical looking environment. And for us, what's interesting is that these plants do just fine under eucalyptus trees. And there's eucalyptus trees are quite common in San Diego, and not many things do too well underneath the eucalyptus tree. So acacia, of all species, tend to do pretty well under eucalyptus and would be a good a good selection for that application. And as I mentioned before, many acacia are allergens to people. So if somebody is allergic to plants, there's a good chance that they are allergic to acacia. And this would be something to consider when selecting these genus and deciding where to put them in a landscape. As a low water use plant, this is a plant that's well adapted to our climate and can thrive with very minimal irrigation, and therefore is considered to be water wise. And this plant can be useful as a hedge or a screen, or on slopes. It does just fine. Oftentimes, I see it in the landscape by itself as kind of a focal point or a specimen. It's not very common. It's not a common choice for San Diego, but it's perfectly adapted to our climate. And if you're going to pick any acacia, this would be definitely one that you should look into because it's quite unique, ornamental, and it has a really interesting character. And the cut branches, again, can be prized as cut flowers, although watch out for the allergen. So there we have Acacia cultriformis, knife acacia. And next we have another acacia. This is Acacia redolens, however you like to pronounce it. Acacia redolens prostrate acacia. And this is also sometimes commonly referred to as freeway acacia because it is so common in San Diego, especially planted alongside of the freeways, that you see this quite a bit. It is a low-growing acacia, typically about 3 feet tall. There are cultivars, cultivated varieties, one with the name Low Boy. That's very common. And those are much shorter. Those are ground covers, maybe just 1 foot tall. But the actual species, 3 feet tall, maybe up to 4 or 5, but 3 foot is your average height. So it's used like a ground cover. And it has, again, the gray-green, bluish-green glaucous phyllodes. Notice how these are round instead of pointed, like the knife acacia. And this one comes from Western Australia, which is actually where the true Mediterranean climate of Australia is found. Just like the knife acacia, this one flowers this time of year. So as you're driving around and observing on the sides of the roads, you will start to see the prostrate acacia coming into flower. And it usually flowers for about 1 month. It's a very common plant in our area. It's one that's so common, it's very often overlooked. And a lot of local designers may choose to look at this plant as kind of average or boring and say, it's just, every landscape has that. Why would I ever want to select the prostrate acacia? Well, as we discussed, they do well under eucalyptus trees and they're good for banks. They're very hardy, they're drought adapted, and they do provide a valuable pollen and nectar source. Pollinators, bees, insects, as well as some birds will be attracted to this plant. So in the right place at the right time, I think every plant has worthy and merit is okay to be selected. And if you think the plant is boring, well, then maybe you're just not creative enough to figure out how to use it in a way that's unique or interesting. So I think it's not the plant that's boring, it's the designer perhaps that's using it in a boring way. But it is quite common, and it's one that is good to recognize, and it's quick to fill up a space. So if you're looking to stabilize the slope, prostrate acacia could be your selection. And you may want to mix in some other species just to give some variety, but this one is almost guaranteed to give you success. And that's part of why we see it so commonly all over the place. We have Acacia redolens, prostrate acacia. And now here's our third and final acacia for the week. This is Acacia stenophylla, the shoestring acacia. And this is a tree as opposed to a shrub, has an upright growth habit, woody tree, to about 25 feet tall. It takes many years for it to grow in thickness, so it looks slender for a long time. But as it ages, it will thicken up, and you'll end up with a very sculptural or very attractive and interesting looking tree. This is actually one of my favorite trees that you don't see too often in San Diego, but I think it should be planted a lot more. They're very drought tolerant, and they could grow into our San Diego desert. And as when they're young, like the photo on the right-hand side, they sort of look deserty or maybe not so attractive. But when you look at these up close and even from a distance, they can have a lot of admirable traits. The phyllodes on this plant are very slender, up to 12 inches long. So it's a foot long and very narrow, which is why it has the nickname or the common name, shoestring acacia. And the seed pods also are quite unique. So they also can be quite long, up to 12 inches long. They dry to a brown color, and you get the seeds are very distinct. So you can see each seed instead of one long pod with seeds inside. The pod tends to hug the seed, and so you can observe all of the seeds inside the pod. Also, kind of unique and a little bit sculptural. It's not necessarily glaucous or gray green or bluish green. These are a little bit more of a true green in color, but they can have a bit of a grayish tint to them. And I think again in this circumstance, it's about selecting them in the right environment and the right time. So obviously, if you're in the desert, this is a great choice. But even here on the coast, there are some unique opportunities to plant this acacia. First of all, it's very hardy and will not attract pests or really have any problems. It looks really good at night if it's lit up. So it forms a nice focal point or a kind of a monument in a landscape. And it's really interesting on a patio or a courtyard where you want to be able to sit under the shade of a tree. And it doesn't drop the leaves too often. So you will develop some leaf litter under this tree, but it's easy to clean around. So even for restaurants that have outdoor dining, this tree would be a good selection for a courtyard or a patio, especially because it's just so hardy and doesn't need much care. It has a bit of a weeping growth habit. So because the phyllodes are so long and they hang down, they give the plant kind of a weeping willow look. And weeping willow's generally not appropriate for San Diego because it needs too much water. So this could be one of your drought tolerant weeping willow replacements. But the tree itself isn't necessarily weeping. The tree is upright, the wood grows upright, and the phyllodes themselves hang down. So there's kind of a unique situation going on with this tree, and I think it's quite interesting. Just like the knife acacia, it is not very common. So you will see it in landscapes and people's front yards and in commercial landscapes, but it's one that I think could be selected a little bit more, especially as our climate shifts towards a little bit more hot, more dry, and unpredictable. This plant, the shoestring acacia, can tolerate a wide range of conditions. So here we have Acacia stenophylla, shoestring acacia. And now we have a common tree to San Diego. This is Erythrina caphra, commonly referred to as the African coral tree. Another common name is the coastal coral tree. So there's several different species of Erythrina. They're all given the common name of coral tree. So what type of coral tree is this? This is Erythrina caphra, and this is a large tree. It gets up to 60 feet tall, but often grows in a spreading habit. So many times it's wider than it is tall. You see these in public parks. You see them along the coast. They have a very unique yellow in their bark, and the trunk of the tree can be somewhat thorny. It's not a true thorn, it's a prickle, kind of like a rose. So it's a thick protrusion that is sharp, and it makes it so that it's not pleasant to climb these trees. Although many times you can still climb them just fine because the shape is so perfect for climbing with the low growing branches. This tree is a little bit weak, so the branches will have a tendency potentially to break, and they can be quite heavy. And so you want to have caution where you choose to plant this. And if you inherit a landscape that has this tree, you may want to watch out for falling or broken limbs. Any arborist can help to assess a limb and make sure it's in a proper angle so that it will be strong and not likely to break. And the other thing that people have issues with this plant is the roots. So the roots tend to be very thick and all on the surface. And so even in a lawn type of application, like we see on the right-hand picture, or next to sidewalks, they will lift up the sidewalk and they can be difficult to work with if you're maintaining this landscape. And they're a bit on the kind of more traditional side. So people used to plant them a lot more. And I think people, landscapers and designers are sort of moving away from this tree, but they're still quite beautiful. And right now is the time when they're starting to flower. There are several different Erythrina species. Some flower when there are no leaves on, and others will flower alongside new leaf growth. And this one flowers when the leaves are present. But typically, this is an evergreen or even like a semi evergreen. It may lose its leaves in very cold conditions. But typically, when it starts to flower in March, is when you have new leaves and flowers. And the flowers are quite stunning. You see that very interesting cluster of red, deep red petals that are coming off of the branch. And typically, they're up on the top ends of the tree. And so you can get sort of a very visual, very from a distance, quite a striking image. The nomenclature, the name of this plant is a little bit interesting as far as history is concerned, and I think it's a good lesson. There's some controversy with the terminology, and there's even a common name that I'm not using anymore because I have learned, I didn't know until recently, but I have learned that it's offensive terminology. So coming from Southeastern Africa, this plant has some common names that are part of the social problems and even the recent history of racism in South Africa. And so the scientific name, unfortunately, Erythrina caphra, that specific epithet, is reference to a word that is used as a derogatory word for uh, people of dark skin in South Africa. Historically, that term is related to Islam and is referred to a person who is a non believer. And there are other places in the world where the term is used to refer to people and it's not necessarily offensive. But in South Africa, it is offensive. It's one of the worst things to be called. And so when it comes to the common name, I've eliminated that from what we do. That's why we're calling it the African coral tree. But we can't change the scientific name. At least we can't deny that it is what it is. And there is a movement among some botanists to try to go through the scientific nomenclature and rewrite some things so that they're more relevant to today's times. But it's interesting that here in the United States, we don't typically have an awareness of uh, other countries and their inner turmoils, but something that I think you should at least be somewhat familiar with and recognize that the history of collecting plants and naming the plants may be somewhat linked to some of the histories that were part of like a violent past, and one that we don't necessarily want to continue moving forward. So I won't say the word. You can look into it more if you're curious, but it's one that I think it's okay to be aware of, and it's okay to use in an academic setting. And I, I personally think of it as more information and more learning for us. So there we have it. There is the African coral tree, Erythrina caphra. And now we have another species of lantana. This is Lantana montevidensis, the trailing lantana. I like this specific epithet. It's fun to say, montevidensis. And it kind of gives you the sensation or the image of it growing in the mountains, kind of in an alpine meadow, perhaps. I don't know for sure that that's where it grows. It's actually from South America in the tropical parts of Brazil and Argentina. But it has this very interesting low growing habit. So this is a ground cover. Notice the flower clusters. They look very similar to our other lantana, but this one is all purple in color. Now it can get a little tricky because there are other cultivars, cultivated varieties of different flower color, and you can even cross and hybridize several species and you can get sort of a rainbow effect of color. But this is the true species, Lantana montevidensis, trailing lantana. You see the image with the monarchs pollinating the flowers. Remember, any cluster of flowers, it's a good indicator that it's a butterfly attracting plant. And this one is quite common in our landscape. You'll see it more and more as you're looking. It's a low water use plant, quite drought tolerant, and has a very long bloom season. So there will be flowers displayed throughout most of the year. Very hardy, doesn't require much maintenance or trimming. You don't need to trim it to keep it really low growing, although over time it will grow to about 3 feet tall. So if you're expecting a plant that stays 6 inches tall, this would not be the right plant. This one's going to get about 3 feet tall, but it grows slow. So it has that prostrate look, that trailing look, and is a great living ground cover for along sidewalks and pathways. It's good in a foreground. So a lot of times you have a sidewalk or a path, and right up front, you want something low, and then you can have middle and high as you look back. And this would be good as sort of that really low ground cover or low growing shrub. And I think they're quite nice. I see them quite a bit in our landscape, and whenever I do, I think we could do with a few more Lantana montevidensis. This plant is a bit hardier than our other Lantana species and can tolerate some colder weather. And when it does, it'll tend to have a bit of a reddish coloring that shows up on the edges of the leaves. You can notice the leaves, how they are fringed. The margin of the leaves seems to have kind of a toothed or a serrate margin. And that tends to get sort of a reddish color when exposed to cold weather. And it can tolerate colder temperatures than Southern California. You can see this up into Northern California as well, tolerate some frost. And so some people may find the reddish color even to be kind of a prized feature. Here in San Diego, I don't see that reddish color too often. In certain parts of the world, this lantana in particular, just like our other one, can be an invasive species, especially in Australia or in Hawaii. But in San Diego, we don't tend to have that problem, and they're quite an appropriate plant choice for most of your landscape applications. So there we have Lantana montevidensis, trailing lantana. Now we've got a second lavender species for you all. This is Lavandula stochys. And I just pronounce it stochys because it's easier to say, but you're welcome to pronounce it in a way that helps you remember how to spell it because there's some extra vowels in there So Stoichos, Stoicus, Stoicus, Lavandula stoicus is how I choose to say it. And this is commonly called Spanish lavender. Even though this one's not just from Spain, and the other one is not just from France, but around here, most people call this Spanish lavender. They call the other one the French lavender. And in other parts of the world, people will call this French lavender. So don't get hung up on the common name. The common name varies when you go to different places. And I like to say every common name is correct, because how can you argue with what people choose to call it? But Lavandula stoicus has a very interesting flower shape, quite distinct. Notice those petals, how they stick up much higher above the plant and are only on the top. So it's got kind of almost like a pineapple look to it. Now, those petals that you see on the top, they are actually not the real petals of the flower, although most people would look at that and just say, oh, it's got purple flowers or purple petals. If you look closely in the image on the right, you can see that there are veins inside, and that gives you the clue that those are modified leaves. And the botanical name for those are bracts, B-R-A-C-T. And so very characteristic bract on this plant. And they kind of stick up looking like rabbit ears or something like that. The true flower is visible in the image, and it's a much darker color, dark purple to black almost in color. And those are found on the 2-inch flower spike, and they are found around all 4 sides. So if you look closely, there's very miniature flowers on the sides, and then the purple bracts stick up on the very top. And that's what gives Spanish lavender a very characteristic look. Otherwise, it's a much stockier and much shorter plant, so typically to about 3 feet tall, low growing shrub. It can be woody, although oftentimes you see it pruned back to keep it looking herbaceous. And just like the French lavender, this one has that sweet fragrance and the perfume-like aroma that people really like. There are several subspecies and cultivars, and it's just a second option as far as lavender goes. And you can mix the two, and with the slightly different shades of colors that you get, these look quite nice. This is common all throughout the Mediterranean region as a native plant, and therefore does very well in our landscape. So here we have Lavandula stoicus, Spanish lavender. And next we have Photinia fraseri, red tip. And this plant is in the Rosaceae family, which is the rose family. And Rosaceae tends to have patterns of 5. So the flowers typically have 5 petals, and roses, for instance, have 5 petals if they're true wild roses. And apples, which are in the Rosaceae, tend to have patterns in the shape of 5. And so this one's related to our native plant, which is a toyon, which we may be able to cover this semester. But this is from Asia, from the Himalayas to Japan, India, and Thailand. And it's kind of a unique plant. First of all, let's take a look at the scientific name. There's an X in there. And if you want to be specific about it, it's actually the multiplication sign, and it's not really the X. Although when you write this down, go ahead and just put an X, because it's hard to put a multiplication sign sometimes. But what that X tells us is that this is a cross or a hybrid. And it is different than a cultivar. So you can cross things, and then you can develop a new type of plant, and then you give it a name, and that's the cultivated variety. But then if you just cross 2 very different species and it creates a new one, that may not be able to give off new fruits or seeds, but it may produce a desirable result. So this is a hybrid, kind of like a mule would be a cross between a horse and a donkey. This is a cross between two Photinia species. And the name red tip tells you what it's prized for. So often you see this as a shrub, and that shrub is one that's kind of hedged or pruned and is evergreen. So most of the time you see the green leaves, and then certain times of the year, this time of the year, with the new growth comes out and emerges with this red color. So it does not have red flowers, it has red leaves, but quite an interesting look to it. And then in the spring, it will develop these white flower clusters that are attracting to pollinators, especially bees. But in the landscape, it's relatively hardy, kind of has a glossy green leaf, gives it a bit of a humid look, like a temperate forest would look, and is a good addition to a San Diego landscape. And I find them quite interesting, and I think they take a little bit of the background. A lot of people don't really pay attention to these plants, but I personally think they're really nice, and in the right application can be just fine. I like these if they're lined up in a hedge, and then you can get a really long pathway where you have the red tips sticking up. And if you wanted to be very ornamental about it, you could actually eliminate the leaves on the bottom and have just the shrub trunks sticking up, but then have all the leaves up top merged together to form a hedge. And that's kind of the official English formal hedge, is where you trim up the bottom and then you see a top line of consistent leaves and colors. And this would be one that would be appropriate for something like that. In our landscape, we typically see it on the right-hand photo, where you just put a few of the shrubs in and they fill up space, and they can be trimmed formally or they can be kind of just kept at a decent size. And otherwise, they'll tend to get 10 feet tall or so, and they'll spread wide, which is not a problem unless you want to have a certain desirable look. The more you trim this plant, the more it will show you the red tips, which is usually what these are prized for. The branches, when cut, can make nice additions to floral arrangements, in particular as sort of a filler or unique colors. And they can be, in the landscape, these shrubs can be trimmed into small trees as well and can take on quite a sculptural look. They can even be trimmed to be flat against a wall in sort of a two-dimensional form that is typically referred to as espalier, which is a French method that's typically used for fruit trees. But these can look quite nice if they're turned into an espalier as well. Most often in the landscape, you just see them like the image on the right. So there we have red tip, Photinia fraseri. And now we have a tree that you no doubt have seen in recent weeks. It's just ending its flower season. This is Pyrus caleriana, the ornamental pear. So all pear trees have the genus Pyrus. And there used to be two different ornamental pears that were planted in San Diego. And they decided, taxonomists decided that, you know what, those are actually the same species. So it used to be said that in San Diego, you shouldn't plant Pyrus caleriana. Instead, you should plant Pyrus kawakamii, and that one was evergreen and the other will drop its leaves. And later they came and they said, you know what? They're all Pyrus caleriana. Some of them just drop their leaves and some of them don't. So we used to call this the evergreen pear, and the other one was called the ornamental pear. But now they're the same species, and we think that the climate has more to do with whether or not they actually lose their leaves than with the actual tree itself. Although there are many named cultivated varieties that you can get that display different growth habits and can be appropriate for different climates. The main prize for this plant is The flowers, which are short-lived, they typically last 2 to 4 weeks, and when they are there, are often the only thing you see. So you'll see all these white flowers on this tree. In warm winters where there's not too much of a cold spell, many times the leaves will stay on the tree, and then you have the flowers and the leaves at the same time. But still, when the flowers are out, they're quite prominent, very attractive, very showy. The tree itself gets to about 40 feet, well, 30 feet tall, I'd say. It's in that 25 to 40-foot category, but I don't see them to 40 feet too often. And if you're in a place where the climate changes, or if you have a cold winter, and in particular, if you get the right tree, you will see the color change. So the image on the right showing the red color of the leaves before they fall. And then in winter, you have the flowers bloom with all new leaves. Coming from China, this one has a very characteristic Asian theme to it, which would be appropriate in an Asian themed landscape. You see these in Japanese gardens. They're different from cherry blossoms, although they tend to have a similar look. And you'll have these ones bloom earlier in the year, and then the cherry blossoms will follow about 6 weeks later. So if you really like the look of the delicate small flowers, then this would be one that you could include. This is a medium water use plant, and it is susceptible to some pests in our area. So we're a bit right on the edge of the climate range for it. And it's one that if our climate continues to get hotter and drier, it's going to be more of a struggle to plant these. So you don't see a lot of young ones. You don't see people planting them, selecting them for newly planted trees, but you'll see a lot of existing ornamental pears in our landscape. And when you do see them, they're quite beautiful to stop and observe. When they're not flowering and when they just have their leaves, which is most of the year, you won't notice them that much. They're kind of just a standard green leaf tree, medium in size. They put off good shade, and they have kind of a distinct bark. The bark is very deep in its ridges. So you'll see gray, and then you'll see kind of black, which is the shadow. And so it ends up looking like a lot of gray and black vertical lines, but really it's just gray in color with deep ridges, and otherwise doesn't stand out much. One of the things that does stand out, in addition to the visual, is the fragrance, the olfactory factor. And these flowers, many people cannot stand the scent of the flowers. So they are considered to be malodorous, which is just the term you use to describe something you don't like the smell of. Some people do like the smell, and smell is obviously subjective. And I have observed that there is a bit of probably a genetic component to smell. When I've given tours to groups of people and I present them with plants that smell bad, usually there's about 10% of a population that will think some certain plants smell good when 90% think it smells not so good. I don't know about 10% and 90% with regards to this plant in particular, but most people I talk to think this smells pretty bad, and they don't like the fragrance. I maybe am in the middle. I don't particularly think they're sweet smelling, but I also don't mind the fragrance. It doesn't bother me. I don't want to run away from the plant, and I think they have a lot of value in our landscape. And so if you have a chance to check out these trees in bloom and you've never smelled them for yourself, go up and take a whiff, and feel free to let me know if you like it or if you don't like it. You probably won't like it, and that's okay. They're still great to look at. They're popular street trees. They're relatively well behaved and clean. And this time of year in particular, they have that stunning white flower display that is provided by the ornamental pear. So here we have Pyrus caleriana ornamental pear. And now we have a very common plant for many reasons. This is rosemary. This is the same rosemary that you eat. in breads or put as an herb on your potatoes. And the scientific name has recently changed. So it is now known as Salvia rosmarinus. Up until very recently, this plant, and going back hundreds of years, has been called Rosmarinus officinalis. But recently, taxonomists realized that it's very closely related to sage, especially in the shape of the flowers. And even though it looks very different than a lot of other sages, it's closely enough related that it should actually be in the Salvia genus. So now rosemary is a type of sage. It comes from the Mediterranean, right on the coast. So this is very tolerant of salt spray, of salt actually in the soil, and it's very hardy in our area. Perfectly climate appropriate, drought adapted. You don't need to water it at all, and it will grow just fine. Very easy to propagate. It's edible, and it is highly attracting to bees who like to pollinate the flowers. And the flowers have a long bloom season, and they're just starting to bloom right about now. And they'll bloom through most of the year. So it's a great plant, great addition for the landscape, evergreen. It's easy to trim and shape. You can shape it into formal hedges if you wanted. There are some cultivars that have a trailing or even a vine, kind of a hanging growth habit, which people like, a prostrate rosemary. But our standard species has a lot of value, a lot of good application. I personally love the smell. I think it's the oils in this plant, I think, are really delicious to eat and great to smell. And one time I made a compost pile out of almost pure rosemary branches, and it's the most pleasant compost pile I ever was able to turn. The fragrance and the oils obviously have some medicinal properties as well. And remember, I'm no doctor, nor am I an herbologist, so I don't tell you what to do, and I don't recommend you do anything. That's up for you to decide and do your own research and talk to your own professionals. But one of the things that rosemary is said to be able to do is help with your memory. So even Shakespeare writes about rosemary being for remembrance. And there are many cultures that say that the oil in rosemary is good for your memory. So you could put some on your hairbrush, brush your hair, then go take a test, and you'll be smelling the rosemary, and that should be helping you with your remembering your facts for your exam. Being salt tolerant, that makes this one a really good candidate for gray water. So if you recycle the water from your house and send that out to the landscape, sometimes that water is a bit salty, and many plants that are sensitive to salt would not do well with the gray water. But rosemary is very hardy and salt tolerant to a degree, and gray water tends to be just the perfect water for rosemary. So it has a lot of broad applications. You can plant it as kind of a Mediterranean garden theme, and it's right at home here in San Diego. So it's a great plant to know, and it's a good one to include in your landscapes. It's very common, but for good reason. So here we have Salvia rosmarinus, rosemary. And last but not least, we have a mock rosemary, and it has the common name of coast rosemary. It's not from the Mediterranean. And this one, the scientific name is Westringia fruticosa. Westringia fruticosa, coast rosemary. And this does not smell like anything. There's no fragrance whatsoever. It just happens to have a visual appearance that looks similar to rosemary. There are some differences. For instance, this one tends to be a little bit taller, between 6 and 10 feet tall, whereas your rosemary tends to be between 4 and 6 feet tall, more often on the 4-foot side. So this one you see more often, 6 to 10 feet. And so it's a little bit taller, and the flowers can be pale blue in color, just like true rosemary, or they can also range up to a white in color, like the image on the left shows. So it's in the same family. It's in the Lamiaceae or the mint family, but this one comes from Eastern Australia. And it's more common in our landscape than you would think. You do see it planted. I think it's one that is perfectly safe to plant and is a good candidate for a lot of applications. It's hardy. It forms a good visual barrier, and you can see it in the image on the right, up against a fence, and it makes the fence completely disappear. It doesn't need to be trimmed or pruned too much. Now, once it's full grown, it won't keep growing. It won't continue to be a problem. It's not susceptible to really any diseases, and it is quite drought tolerant. It's a low water use plant. So for all those reasons, it's a great choice in the landscape, but not necessarily considered edible, medicinal, or really, it doesn't have too many other very interesting characteristics that make it one of the ones people pay close attention to. It is out there, and you will see it. And when you see it, uh, I always like when I see it because I feel like it's a little secret. It's one that is a good San Diego landscape plant, but most people don't know the name of it. They don't know what it is, and they'll just pass it right by. And I always like to try to pay special attention to the ordinary things that most people don't recognize as having much extraordinary features. But I think it's a good one, and I like to include it with rosemary so you can compare the two. And if you're ever looking side by side, it's worthwhile to stop and observe the differences. If you look closely, the leaves, you can tell a difference. Notice how these are pointed. So these are acuminate in their apex of the leaf, and the arrangement is a little bit different. Like with most Lamiaceae, this is alternate opposite. So you have two leaves coming out, and then it'll go up, and you'll have two more leaves coming out in sort of that square pattern. But they tend to be closer together, and they look much more whorled. They look more like there are many leaves coming out of the single point. Whereas rosemary tends to be a little bit more of a rounded leaf apex and a little bit more consistent distribution of leaves along the stem. So they're easy to tell apart when you see them in person, but they tend to play similar roles in the landscape. And here, Westringia fruticosa is a very climate appropriate and evergreen, useful shrub in the landscape. So here we have Westringia fruticosa, coast rosemary. So there we go. There's our second 10 plants. That will bring us up to 20 species. And after this, we'll study our plants for the week. Next week, we'll have our first exam. I'll give you plenty of guidance so you'll know exactly how to study and what to look for. And we're going to take all 20 of these plants and we're going to test our knowledge on their identification and maybe some of their uses. And then from there, you'll get a feel for how we'll be following the pattern along for the rest of the semesters. I hope you're finding it enjoyable and interesting. I really like to see when you can spot these in the wild, so to speak, out in the neighborhoods and in the landscapes, and share those photos. It really helps to have everybody keeping an eye out for what's going on and what's looking interesting. And then when I get to see what you see, it helps me to know that, okay, those are worth your time and energy. And I hope you're seeing things in a way you've never seen them before. I really enjoy this subject, and I hope you enjoy the way that I am able to bring it to you here online.